Have you noticed it? That strange tension humming beneath the surface of everyday life. Like the air has shifted. Like everyone's holding their breath, bracing for something unnamed. You can feel it in the group chats, in the headlines, in the comments that echo each other like a chorus. A video goes viral, a rumor spreads, a single phrase is repeated until it hardens into belief. And just like that, we all start thinking the same thing, or pretending to, because in moments like these, silence doesn't feel safe, it feels dangerous. This isn't just connection, it's contagion. And it doesn't come from a virus, it comes from us. And today we're stepping into the fog of mass formation psychosis, a phrase that set the internet on fire during the pandemic, but taps into something far older, a mirror held up to history's most feverish moments: Salem, McCarthyism, moral panics. It's what happens when fear spreads faster than facts, when crowds become mobs, when people stop asking questions and start lighting torches. From the screams of the 17th century witch trials to the scroll of your For You page, the pattern repeats: isolation, uncertainty, and then hysteria. This is American nightmares, mass formation psychosis. And the scariest part isn't that we're losing our minds, it's that we're doing it together. Chapter 1: The Madness of Crowds. Mass formation psychosis didn't crawl out of academia. It detonated in the middle of a cultural war. When Dr. Robert Malone spoke the phrase on the Joe Rogan Experience, it wasn't received like a fringe theory. It was received like a diagnosis. Millions were already searching for language to explain the strange disassociation that had taken hold during the pandemic. The cognitive dissonance, the hyperactivity, the way friends stopped speaking after a single disagreement. It was like waking up inside a story you didn't remember agreeing to, but somehow couldn't escape. To hear it named a mass psychological event felt clarifying, like turning on a light in a long dark hallway. But to call it new is to forget how often we've danced this dance. In 1692, in the Puritan village of Salem, a group of young girls began to convulse. They screamed, they cried, they named names. And within weeks, neighbors were accusing neighbors of dancing with the devil. What most forget is how quickly the story metastasized. This wasn't a single accusation, it was a viral narrative, and one that snowballed under the weight of colonial anxieties, disease, displacement, and spiritual uncertainty. The village was already on edge. The girls just lit the match. And by the time the trials ended, 20 people were executed and over 200 were accused. Many historians now believe these events were less about witchcraft and more about trauma, fear, and power, and all converging in a tight theocratic echo chamber. Sound familiar? In the 1930s, fear took another shape. The Great Depression had fractured the American psyche. Global fascism was rising, so when Orson Welles aired a dramatized War of the Worlds broadcast in 1938, hundreds of thousands of Americans believed Earth was being invaded by Martians. Some fled their homes. Others jammed emergency phone lines. Despite clear disclaimers, the panic was real. Because the fear was already there. The radio didn't invent it, it merely tuned in. And then, of course, came the 20th century most bureaucratic hysteria, McCarthyism. Under the glow of Cold War paranoia, a red pen became a weapon. Writers, teachers, actors, even librarians were blacklisted on suspicion of communist ties. Proof was optional. Fear was enough. The emotional logic of the masses became state policy. To question the process was to invite suspicion. Conformity wasn't just expected, it was enforced. Under the guise of protection, freedom evaporated. Fast forward to the 80s, and we arrive at the satanic panic. The nation's daycare centers, mundane maternal places became the imagined front lines of demonic rituals. Children coaxed by memory recovery, therapists recounted impossible tales. Flying teachers, underground tunnels, blood rites under nap mats. There was no evidence, and yet lives were destroyed. People went to prison for crimes that never happened. Why? Because the story made sense to a terrified society, one that had grown deeply anxious about women in the workforce, about shifting gender roles, and broken trust in family structures. And here's the through line in each case. What mattered wasn't truth, it was emotional plausibility. If a story felt true, it became true. Because in a society overwhelmed by change, fear offers something intoxicating: certainty. Mass formation doesn't need facts, it needs a frame. It needs isolation, uncertainty, a triggering narrative, and a stage on which to perform it. In 1692, the stage was the pulpit. In 1952, it was the courtroom. 2021 it was your social feed. The backdrop changes, the human instinct doesn't. Chapter 2, the theater of the tranced. The internet didn't invent hysteria, but it mechanized it. What once drifted slowly from person to person now floods our minds at algorithmic speed. Precision, targeted, and emotionally engineered. And nowhere is this digital delirium more potent than on TikTok. What looks like a feed of dance trends, beauty routines, and meme culture is actually something more powerful and more dangerous. It's a stage, a seance, a feedback loop for mass suggestion. Every scroll is a tiny spell. Aesthetic spirals like core, a haunting blend of nostalgia, climate dread, and emotional voyeurism, or that girl, morning routines disguised as empowerment rituals, aren't just content. They're blueprints for identity, scripts for how to feel, community for the lost and anxious. But this isn't community in the old sense, it's performance, and the algorithm is the casting director. This isn't random. The platforms reward emotional extremity. Fear, sadness, trauma, these aren't side effects, they're the product. Content that makes us cry, flinch, relate, spiral, is pushed, prioritized, and monetized. What starts as a ghost story or a skincare tip becomes a rabbit hole of hyper-curated panic. Nowhere is this more visible than in diagnosis culture. Videos claiming to explain mental illness, cut to dreamy music, pastel overlays, and poetic captions offer an illusion of self-understanding. Teens are diagnosing themselves with disorders once considered rare, complex, and difficult to treat. Tourette's, dissociative identity disorder, ADHD, autism, all distilled into a carousel of symptoms, all flattened into trend cycles. It's not about healing, it's about belonging. Pain becomes aesthetic, suffering becomes shareable, and slowly reality blurs. Social media doesn't just reflect our identities, it scripts them. Every post is a scene, every reaction a cue. Authenticity is replaced by virality, and truth becomes a look, a vibe, and a mood board. We aren't expressing ourselves, we're uploading avatars. This isn't hysteria in the traditional sense, it's hyper-reality, a Baudrillardian nightmare where the copy replaces the original, where what's real no longer matters, only what trends. The line between performance and perception collapses, and what's left is a digital trance state. Endless dopamine loops, curated dread, and existential roleplay. And behind it all, the algorithm pulses, steady and unseen, not leading us towards meaning, but towards momentum, not knowledge but noise, not clarity but chaos. Chapter 3, Hysteria has always been feminine. Throughout history, mass hysteria has worn a woman's face. The very word hysteria comes from the Greek hysteria meaning womb, a not so subtle clue that for centuries, Western medicine and culture alike have pathologized femininity itself. Emotions become symptoms. Intuition became instability. A woman too sad, too loud, too sexual, too strange was labeled unwell, mad, and dangerous. And so the archetype of this hysterical woman was born. In the Victorian era, she was institutionalized or surgically corrected. In the 20th century, she was given pills and told to smile. And in the age of social media, she's mocked, memed, and medicalized. Her pain turned into content. Her breakdown aestheticized for likes. But what if the truth is more complicated? What if women haven't been more delusional, but simply more visible in their distress? More vulnerable to the gaze, to cultural projection, to scrutiny disguised as concern. Look closer at the history of mass delusion, and you'll see the pattern. In Salem, it was young girls whose trauma and powerlessness were ignored until it was transformed into accusation. In the 80s satanic panic, it was mostly women daycare workers, single mothers, and female caregivers who were accused of grotesque crimes based on fantasies planted by others. The culture framed them not as professionals, but as threats to innocence. Their proximity to children made them suspicious. Their femininity made them expendable. And today the pattern persists, just in digital form. The sad girls of TikTok posting pastel-filtered videos about mental illness and loneliness are often mocked for being dramatic, attention-seeking, and unstable. Diagnosis culture is frequently dismissed as narcissism, but beneath the spectacle lies something raw, a generation of young women using the only tools they have, language, aesthetics, community, to express the void they've inherited. Economic insecurity, climate dread, relationship trauma, a medical system that gaslights them, a culture that tells them to perform perfection and punishes them for feeling too much. When women express emotional distress in public, it's almost never taken at face value. Instead, it's dissected, doubted, and dismantled as hysteria. And that's the trap. What looks like irrationality is often an indictment of the conditions that created it. What appears performative might actually be survival. In a society that refuses to listen, the performance becomes the message. We've been taught to see mass delusion as a glitch in the feminine psyche. But maybe it's a mirror reflecting back everything women have been told not to say. Maybe it's not that women are more hysterical, hysterical, but they've always been more haunted. So when a girl online posts about her panic attacks, or a daycare worker is accused of unspeakable acts with no evidence, or a generation of teens spiral into digital identity crisis, ask yourself, is this hysteria or is it a collective scream, misunderstood and conveniently ignored? Because sometimes mass delusion isn't a symptom of madness. Sometimes it's a protest no one wants to understand. Chapter 4, Conspiracy Culture and the Comfort of Seeing Clearly. There's something oddly comforting about a conspiracy theory. Not the sensationalism, not the panic, but the order. The sense that behind the chaos, someone is steering the ship. That even if the truth is terrible, at least there is one, in a world that feels increasingly fragmented and absurd. Conspiracy theories don't thrive on delusion. They thrive on pattern recognition. They appeal not to the ignorant, but to the disenchanted. And the reason so many people are disenchanted is painfully clear. History has taught them to be. Think about it. What we now know about MKUltra, the legal secret program run by the CIA, sounds like something out of a dystopian horror novel. Unwitting test subjects were dosed with LSD, sometimes for weeks at a time. They were locked in isolation, stripped of sensory input, and observed like lab rats. Some experienced psychotic breaks, some never recovered. Some, like Frank Olson, died, but for decades this was called a conspiracy theory. Only after tenacious journalists pried open sealed files under the Freedom of Information Act did the truth emerge. And it wasn't just MKUltra. Project Sunshine, launched in the 1950s, saw the US government secretly collecting and experimenting on the remains of deceased infants, without the consent of grieving families, to study the effects of nuclear fallout. The revelations came decades later. At the time, those who questioned the safety of atomic testing were mocked as hysterical. Then there's the Operation Mockingbird, a CIA initiative to infiltrate and control major media outlets. At its height, the program had over 400 journalists on its payroll. The line between journalism and propaganda blurred so completely that many stories read more like PR than reporting. When this came to light in the 70s, trust in the media institutions cratered, and for a good reason. By the 80s, this erosion of trust had evolved into something more cultural, not just political. People no longer took government statements at face value. Scandals, real scandals, were surfacing too often. Iran-Contra, savings and loan. Each new revelation made the last seem tame by comparison. Each one reminded the public that transparency was more performance than principle. Even in the 1990s and early 2000s, stories that felt fringe slowly became accepted. The pharmaceutical industry was exposed for its predatory marketing of opioids, a crisis that would kill hundreds of thousands. The financial elite were revealed to be gambling with pension funds and national economies. And when the House of Cards collapsed in 2008, no one of real power was held accountable. The average person watched their savings vanish, while the CEOs responsible flew private jets to congressional hearings. These aren't just events, they're traumas, cultural, collective betrayals that leave behind a residue, a shadow of doubt that lingers long after the headlines fade. And that shadow is where conspiracy culture lives. To the mainstream, this culture looks chaotic, but from within it's a response to the chaos, a method of processing trauma when the official channels for grief and accountability fail. That's why these theories are emotionally resonant. They don't just explain events, they validate the feeling that someone is deeply wrong. Almost every conspiracy theory has come true, to be honest, and the pandemic poured gasoline on this fire. People were locked in their homes, screens became their only window to the world. They watched guidelines shift week to week, sometimes with no explanation. They saw dissenting scientists deplatformed, even when their predictions later proved accurate. They watched governments enforce curfews while politicians attended private dinners. They watched big tech, big pharma, and big government merge into a feedback loop that always seemed to favor consolidation over clarity. And when they asked questions, they were labeled dangerous. This is the moment where conspiracy becomes emotional truth. When you feel that something is off, when every institution that claims to protect you behaves like it has something to hide, you start looking elsewhere. You don't watch chaos, you watch coherence. You want to believe that pain means something. This is why even the most implausible theories can go viral, because they offer narrative closure in a world that no longer offers explanations, only distraction. But here's the paradox. Even when these stories aren't true, they reveal something true about our institutions, about our fears, about our yearning for meaning in the ruins of trust. Conspiracy theories often begin where transparency ends, and that's why mocking them is not just ineffective, it's condescending. It ignores the context that gave rise to them. It assumes that belief is the problem, when in fact, disbelief, the ability to trust, is what fuels the fire. You can't fact-check someone out of trauma. You can't debunk your way out of a wound. So instead of asking why do people believe this, maybe you should ask what made them stop believing everything else. Because the mass formation doesn't just emerge from ignorance, it emerges from betrayal. And when betrayal becomes a cultural norm, hysteria doesn't need to be manufactured. It becomes ambient, background noise, the hum beneath every headline. In this environment, conspiracy is often the first word we hear when someone dares to speak an inconvenient truth. But if history teaches us anything, it's this: the truth doesn't always arrive dressed for dinner. Sometimes it comes broken, disheveled, incomplete. Sometimes it's a whisper before it's a headline. And sometimes the people we call conspiracy theorists are just the ones listening too closely and are usually the ones who are right. Chapter 5, The Age of Manufactured Reality. What if the hysteria isn't a bug but the feature? What if the system we live in thrives not in spite of our confusion and fear, but because of it? In today's world, reality isn't something we discover, it's something we're fed. Experience, wisdom, intuition, these have all been demoted. Now truth is whatever survives the algorithm. It's packaged, digitally sculpted, focus grouped, optimized for virality and brand synergy. A headline isn't meant to inform you, it's meant to capture you, to hold your gaze just long enough to sell you an idea or a product. Boardrooms, data farms, content calendars, these are the new templates of perception. And in these templates, storytelling isn't sacred, it's strategic. What trends isn't what's nuanced or necessary, it's what works, what ignites us: rage, tribalism, self-righteousness, spectacle. And so the stories we tell ourselves about our politics, our identity, our world arrive pre-chewed and filtered through layers of manipulation. 15-second clips, 280-character rants, a slideshow set to Billie Eilish, and a soft lighting that explains your entire identity in 5 bullet points. We no longer live stories, we scroll them. And somewhere in the endless stream, we stopped asking if what we were seeing was real, because it doesn't matter. What matters is if it resonates, if it performs, if it gets the right kind of attention. We don't just consume narratives, we're imprisoned by them. Each of us locked in a feedback loop of outrage and aesthetic allegiance, endlessly curated and reaffirmed by invisible code. Reality has become a choose-your-own-life adventure, but with a sinister twist. Someone else keeps writing the options. You can be anxious or angry, confused or crusading, but whatever you pick, it must signal allegiance, and it must never, ever stop moving. Because in this economy, attention is king. Not truth, not thoughtfulness, not even coherence, just attention. The systems that shape our digital lives, media, politics, and tech aren't fighting for your trust. They're farming for your reaction. Every scroll, every tweet, every comment is raw data. You're not the consumer, you're the product. And this is where mass formation psychosis finds its most fertile ground. In a world that rewards constant reaction, stillness becomes suspicious. Silence becomes suspect. Every opinion must be performative, every pause interpreted as betrayal. You are always on display, always choosing a side, always broadcasting your internal world through someone else's filter. We don't seek truth anymore, we seek confirmation. Not knowledge, but proof that we belong, that we're on the right side of the algorithm, the trend, the outrage. And if you deviate, if you dare ask a question that doesn't fit the script, you're erased, mocked, shadow banned, reduced to digital static. And here's the deeper cost, the one that we don't tweet about. It's not that just we've lost a shared sense of reality, it's that we've forgotten how to miss it. Something sacred is dissolving. Not just the truth, but the capacity to sit in its absence, the quiet ache of mystery, the pause between thoughts, the humility of not knowing, the part of us that whispers, what if I'm wrong? Because doubt, nuance, contradiction, these things are human, but they don't trend, they don't convert, and so they vanish one scroll at a time. In this world, mass formation isn't an accident, it's a feature, a design. A pressure cooker of curated dread, engineered distraction, and emotional fatigue. We're not hypnotized by accident, we're hypnotized on purpose. Here's what the system can't monetize: silence and reflection. The slow, stubborn work of reclaiming your mind. That moment when you close the app, look around, and realize the world isn't burning, it's just been edited that way. And maybe, just maybe, that's where the real rebellion begins. Not in shouting louder, but in listening deeper. Not in performing your opinion, but in questioning its origin. In following the narrative, but in stepping outside of it. Because the algorithm wants your reaction, not your awakening. So if the world's feels like it's slipping into madness, maybe the most radical thing you can do is remember yourself. So what is mass formation psychosis really? Is it a medical theory, a fringe idea, a cultural warning sign, or is it something more reflective, something closer to a mirror held up to your collective soul? What we often call hysteria isn't always madness. Sometimes it's grief, sometimes it's alienation with a mask on. It's what happens when people feel unseen, unheard, and unrooted. When the world feels too fast, too artificial, too hollow to hold. In that emptiness, we grasp for something, anything that feels real. And that's when the fantasy begins, not because we're weak, not because we're wired for meaning. And if we don't find it in truth, we'll take it in illusion. We tell ourselves we're too smart to fall for it. But mass delusion doesn't feel like delusion when you're in it. It feels like clarity, like certainty, like belonging. It whispers, you're not alone. And in a lonely world, that's a powerful drug. But here's the quiet terror. What if the hysteria isn't accidental? What if the confusion is curated, the fear orchestrated? What if the algorithm isn't failing? It's working exactly how it was designed, keeping us reactive, divided, addicted, distracted from the one truth we don't want to face, that we've outsourced our thoughts, rented out our sense of self, let our minds be colonized by headlines, hashtags, and hot takes. Every panic starts the same way, a whisper, a headline, and a trend. A video that tells you to be afraid. It doesn't matter if it's true, it matters that it spreads. And it matters that you believe it at first, loudest and most passionately. That's how hysteria works. It's not a scream, it's a song. And once you start singing, it's hard to stop. But you can stop. You can notice the trance. You can feel the script tightening and step outside of it. You can ask the hardest question of all. Is this my voice, or am I just the echo of a crowd? Because you're not immune to mass formation. None of us are. But you are capable of waking up and choosing stillness over spectacle, clarity over clout, truth over theater. The spell only works if we stay asleep. So consider this your wake-up call. Not to panic, but to remember, to return to yourself. Because in a world addicted to delusion, the most radical act is simply see things as they are and to ask every single day, whose dream am I living in? And it's true, I don't know. It's all crazy. Anyways, thanks for watching. I'd love to know your opinion on this subject.